I'm going to try to be a little honest today. That's really hard for lawyers and preachers. But I heard a message real similar to this that Jennison Franklin preached. And I didn't steal his texts, but I did steal a clip. So you'll see that a little later. But how many ever played chess? Okay. Yeah. Chess is like what rich people play instead of checkers. That's what I used to think when I was a kid, you know. Somebody plays checkers, they're poor. Somebody plays chess, they're rich. But chess is difficult. Checkers is cool because you can just like boom, 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 boom. Chess, every player has a different kind of move and a different kind of structure. And whenever you're in trouble in chess, they always say the same thing. Check. But here's the cool thing. If you get checked, it means you got one more move. And that move, if you're a good chess player, you might want that person to say check because you're setting them up in a trap. And that move's going to change the whole game. Or if you're a good player, you might not have to worry about having just one more move because you got a lot of moves before you're in trouble. Or if you play like me, your next move is going to be your last. Because they're going to say checkmate after you've made the next move. Because I am not good at chess. So if you ever want to make a lot of money, bet me against chess. But I won't. I'm smart enough not to do that. But yeah, chess is not good. Number one, Samson was blind and weak when the Philistines decided to mock him. Samson was blind and weak when the Philistines decided to mock him. Samson was doing pretty good as the judge. And Samson had been told there were a lot of things he shouldn't do. He'd taken a Nazirite vow. He wasn't supposed to eat anything from an unclean place, like honey from a dead carcass. He wasn't supposed to touch anything unclean, like a dead body or a jawbone. There's a lot of things that he wasn't supposed to do. One of those things was, as a Nazirite, he was a Nazirite from birth, so he never had to shave his head. If you took a Nazirite vow today, you would shave your head, and then you would let your hair grow as long as it could for the length of the vow that you take. Well, Samson had never had to shave his head. He was a Nazirite from birth. So he had this big, long hair. And I don't know what it looked like. I don't know if it was in dreadlocks, or I don't know if it was Goldilocks, or I don't know what it was. I just know he had a lot of hair. And Delilah, who was basically working with the Philistines, but Samson had kind of been smitten by her. Samson had a lot of relationship problems. And he went to Delilah, and she said, "Oh, Samson, you're so beautiful. Tell me the secret of your great strength." And so Samson tells her some nonsense. And she goes ahead and does that nonsense. "Samson, Samson, wake up, the Philistines are upon you." And Samson wakes up, and he breaks the chains that she put him in, or the ropes that she put him in, and he goes and whoops the Philistines. And then she says, "Oh, Samson, Samson, you are making sport of me. You will not tell me the secret of your strength." Well, she does this 3 times. So I don't think Samson could have been super bright. Because if every time your girlfriend asks you what will make you weak, and she goes ahead and like ties you up or does something like that and then screams, "The Philistines are upon you," by the 3rd time you should be going, "Hey, wait a minute." But she finally goes, "Oh, Samson, won't you tell me the secret of your great strength?" So Samson said something that I think upset the Lord. Because like I said before, he'd already defiled himself by touching his own body. He already defiled himself by eating honey from a carcass. He'd already defiled himself with his relationships with other women. Here's the thing. It was the Spirit and the power of God that was upon him. And Samson got his eyes off of the grace and mercy of God and got his eyes on works. And his work was this. He honestly believed the one thing he hadn't defiled, the one thing he hadn't done, he honestly believed his strength came from his hair. There's some Christians walking around and, maybe there's certain things they haven't done. They might have messed up and they might have sinned here, they might have sinned there, but I have never tasted alcohol. Well, that's great. But the problem is, that's not what we put our faith in. We don't put our faith in our good works. We put our faith in our good Lord, in God, in what He can do. Samson said, if you cut off all my hair, I'll be as weak as a baby. And here's the interesting thing. I believe when he said that, God saw that he really felt that in his heart. He thought that his strength came from his hair, and it didn't. It came from Almighty God. So when Delilah gave him a haircut, God allowed his strength to dissipate. Boom. And the Philistines came upon him. And they grabbed him and they were able to seize him. I think he was confused. And I always wonder what Samson looked like. Because you watch like movies and TV shows and you see some ripped guy, with big long hair and looks kind of like, Fabio or something. I am Samson. And I always thought it'd be kind of funny if Samson had great strength but looked kind of like Woody Allen. You Philistines better leave me alone or we're going to get serious here. I mean, that would be definitely strength from God, Like really long hair, this little skinny guy, like, come on. But Samson, regardless of how he looked, they took him, they poked his eyes out. Isn't that disgusting? And then what they did was they tied him to a grain mill. So he was just treading out grain. Then, what we're going to pick up is the Philistines held a great festival. And they were celebrating their pagan gods, and they were just having a wonderful time. And they said, hey, let's get Samson out here. He's one of our trophies. His God was so powerful and mighty. We got him grinding grain for us. Go get Samson. So we pick up in Judges 16:23 through 30. The Philistine rulers held a great festival, offering sacrifices and praises to their god Dagon. They said, our God has given us victory over our enemy Samson. When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, our God has delivered our enemy to us, the one who killed so many of us now in power. Half drunk by now, the people demanded, bring out Samson so he can amuse us. So he was brought from the prison to amuse them. And they had him stand between the pillars supporting the roof. Samson said to the young servant who was leading him by the hand, place my hands against the pillars that hold up the temple. I want to rest against them. But the temple was completely filled with people. All the Philistine rulers were there, and there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof who were watching as Samson amused them. So you got the temple full, and then you got the roof full of people. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, sovereign Lord, remember me again. Interesting thing is Samson prays to God and not his hair. He's the sovereign Lord. What does that word sovereign mean? It means God is God and he can do anything he wants. We don't control him. He's sovereign. He can't be bent by our wills. He says, sovereign Lord, remember me again, O God. Please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my two eyes. And Samson put his hands on the two center pillars that held up the temple, pushing against them with both hands. And he prayed, let me die with the Philistines. And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. The greatest victory he ever saw was at that moment. But let's back that up a few days. Let's back it up to where he's blind and he's just pushing grain. What's he thinking in his mind? He's thinking, I'm over. I'm done. See, there's a lot of us that get into places like that. There's a lot of us that go through circumstances, and we go through trials, and we go through tribulations, and we get to that point where we feel like we're blind, and we're chained, and we're bound, and there's nothing else that we can do. And that's when the enemy comes in and says, check. He comes in and says, I got you. But the amazing thing is, with God, all things are possible. And when Samson stands between those pillars, he realizes something. Holy Spirit wells up and he goes, I got one more move. I got one more move. Sovereign God, let me die with the Philistines. And the party was over after the pillars split apart. See, a lot of us, we give up. We get to that place where we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going to happen. And we go, oh, a check becomes a checkmate. I'm done. I'm toast. I can't make it anymore. I've come as far as I can possibly go. And when we give up, when we start to give up, that's what the enemy wants. He wants you to give up at that point. Because the enemy knows something. He knows that God always has one more move. And that can be a game changer. That can be a game changer. So number 2. There was a woman who was brought before Christ with a death sentence on her head. A woman was brought before Christ with a death sentence on her head. And basically, what happened in this situation is something that happens to a lot of us. She was caught in sin. Most of our struggles is when we're caught in sin. When we're not caught in sin, we don't struggle with it. But when we do get caught in sin, has anybody ever caught you saying something that wasn't true? None of you are married, huh? So my wife catches me all the time, because I don't listen to myself. I talk without thinking, and I don't stop and take notes. That can be a problem sometimes. Because nobody ever tells me, Nicole never stops and says, Troy, remember what you said? You said you were going to do this, 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 this. I don't get that. She waits until time's up and I can't do anything about it. Then she says, you know what you were supposed to do today? Why can't you just remind me? Tell me in advance. Sometimes she does tell me in advance, so I got to be honest. But she never tells me what it is. Do you remember what you were supposed to do today? I'm like, sure. How was I going to go about that? You know, you're always trying to fish for information. But she's too smart for that. She's like, well, why don't you tell me what you were going to do? Then you become like a little kid. You know, little kids, it's amazing, little kids will tell you lies where you can blatantly see the truth. They'll put their hand in a piece of cake, eat it. And you'll walk in and go, did you just scoop out of that cake and eat it? They'll have chocolate cake. I'm like, no. They have more hope than anyone. So sometimes we get into these situations where we're caught because we've done something stupid. And this was a situation where this woman was caught in a lie as much as she was caught in the act of adultery. And I always think about this story and I always wonder, why didn't they drag a guy there too? There was 2 of them involved in that. They just dragged the woman. And so, a woman was brought before Christ with a death sentence on her head. John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. Jesus returned to the Mount of Olives, but early the next morning, he was back again at the temple. A crowd soon gathered, and he sat down and taught them. As he was speaking, the teachers of the religious law and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. "Teacher," they said to Jesus, "this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. But what do you say?" See, they were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him. But Jesus stopped, stooped down, and wrote in the dust with his finger. Let me tell you something about that. These people were religious, okay? This is the definition of religious people. Religious people are always trying to trap you. And it gets, it's so frustrating. Because a religious person, when they ask you a question, they already know the answer that they want. They're just hoping you don't give it to them. Religious people, when they come up to you to accuse you, they've already convicted you. So it doesn't really matter what you say or what you do. This whole thing was to try to destroy Christ's ministry. Because there were Pharisees and Sadducees that were saying, look, this guy is preaching, forgive your enemies. He's saying no longer let it be said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But when somebody strikes you, turn the other cheek. Well, if this guy really believes that, then he's going to have to break the law of Moses in order to proclaim that. And we'll call him a lawbreaker, destroy his ministry, and write him off. But if he does stone this lady, if he says, well, if that's what the law says, go ahead and do it, then we'll kill her and call him a liar. We'll say, look, he let this lady die. He's all this forgiveness and turn the other cheek. And he just says stone her because he has to abide by the law just like everybody else. He's not special. He's not unique. The people leave him alone. That's what they were trying to do to Jesus. This whole situation wasn't about the woman. It was about using that woman to incriminate Jesus somehow so that they could discredit him. But it says Jesus stooped down and started writing in the dust with his finger, and it never tells us what he wrote. Wouldn't that be interesting to know what he wrote in the dust? It would be so interesting. Maybe he wrote the name of her boyfriend down there, or the guy that was with her, who might have been maybe one of the priests. I don't know. Maybe he wrote the name of their girlfriends down in the sand. I don't know. Whatever he wrote in the sand, I think they might have taken note of it. Because even John takes note of it. Something significant. But the Bible doesn't tell us. It's one of those questions. It's one of those questions when we get to heaven, you know. We got all these deep questions. They'll be like, what'd you write in the sand? But they kept demanding an answer. So Jesus is kind of ignoring it. He's kind of like, oh, he's just doodling. He's not listening to us. So he stood up, once again, looked at him and said, all right, go ahead and stone her, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. See, here's what Jesus did. He just did the same thing to them that they had done to him. Because if they chuck a stone, they're proclaiming themselves sinless. They're proclaiming themselves perfect, and they're blaspheming God. If they don't chuck a stone, they're breaking the law of Moses. See, here come these Pharisees and Sadducees, these religious. Check, Jesus. And Jesus is cool. He's not like, oh, I'm so scared. He stoops down. Checkmate, boys. They start to walk away. They threw down their stones. And I don't think they all threw their stones down at the same time. I think it happened gradually. Because I think some of them really were like... The hardest thing to do is get a religious person to drop a stone. Unless they have kidney stones. Gallstones. They don't care for the Rolling Stones. But it's hard to get a religious person to find that place of grace where they're like, I've sinned. I've sinned. You know what you're qualified to do? This is what God has given us the qualifications to do. To love one another. Do you know what we're not qualified to do? We're not qualified to judge one another. That's why Jesus said, judge not, lest you be judged in a likewise manner. Now, there are times as a body we have to make decisions and judgments. But when it comes to one another, the reason that we can't really judge each other is because we're all flawed. You may do a good job of not doing this or not doing that. But somebody else is doing a good job of something else that you're not. And for every stone you want to chuck at them, they could find a stone to chuck at you. And then pretty soon it just becomes a big stone chucking contest. So, the accusers heard this. They slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest. Only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. This is a beautiful scene. Here's this lady. And we don't know. Some people thought she might have been, if she was caught in the act of adultery, she might have been semi-clothed, naked, thrown in the dirt, probably weeping, scared, shaking, trembling. Her body probably filthy with dust. And I grew up in North Dakota when we used to have the combines running in the fall. And I had horrible hay fever. And once in a while, my father decided to torture me by dropping me off at some old farmer's place and making me ride in the combine all day. And I would just sneeze and sneeze and sneeze, but it's so dusty that I'd just be like, dirt would be mad at all over me. And I can imagine this lady's got the same situation going on. There's the dust, and she watches her accusers walk off one by one. And then she has to do something for Jesus, for herself. Verse 10 says, when Jesus stood up again, he said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? She has to stand up and she has to say, no, Lord. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. She had to proclaim through faith that her condemnation is gone. That had to be a proclamation, because some of us wouldn't have done that. Some of us said, oh Lord, some of those guys left, but I know there's probably still a lot of people that think bad about me. And I know there's probably still a lot of people that, no. Faith doesn't deal with your neurosis. Faith is saying, no one condemns me. And that's what God says, neither do I. Go and sin no more. Now, he gave her forgiveness, but he also gave her an order too. Basically, essentially, he said, don't do this again. You've been freed. You don't have to do this. You can be a different person. So for this lady, she got into the situation where the enemy grabbed her. The enemy caught her in the midst of sin. And the enemy threw her down and said, check. And the only expectancy until Jesus intervened in that woman's life was that she was about to die a horrible death. Those big stones were going to come down. And you wonder why people are afraid of coming to church. I'll tell you why people are afraid of coming to church. Because they read stories like this. And a lot of people think that when they get to church, there's just going to be a bunch of angry people with big stones waiting for them. They're like, I don't want to go there. If you knew the church was a place with angry people and big stones, would you want to come? No. Now, there are some people that really enjoy getting stoned, but not that kind of way. So they wouldn't want to come. The only expectancy that this lady had was death. And sometimes when we forget about the grace of God and the love of God and the mercy of God, and we just kind of get, you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do this, you're going to... We start proclaiming that. We're proclaiming death. And we wonder why people aren't attracted to our wonderful, loving Savior. Sometimes as followers, we carry big stones. And this lady was in check. Enemy was whispering in her ear, you're gonna die. And not just that, but you're gonna die in your sin. You're gonna die in your sin. You're over. You knew this day was coming. You got caught, and now you're gonna die. But just when the enemy said check, Jesus stepped in. And he said, I got one more move. And she went that day from death to life. From no purpose. She went that day from no purpose and no self-respect to knowing that the God of the universe loved her and did not condemn her. Can you imagine that? You know, there's times when you feel like the weight of the world is on your shoulders and everyone is against you. And when you feel that way, don't forget that the God of the universe loves you. He created you for a purpose. He made you for a reason. And no matter how bad it gets, He's got one more move. He's got one more move. So number 3. Can you imagine what the death of Jesus Christ must have felt like to His disciples? If you've been following Jesus for around 3 years, and you've seen His miracles, and you'd heard all His stories, and you loved His teaching, and you loved His personality, and you said, this guy's going to be our king. And that's what all the disciples believed, that Jesus was going to set up an earthly kingdom. They would argue with each other. When Jesus becomes king, I'm going to sit on His right side. Oh, no, I'm going to sit on His right side. You can sit on His left. And they'd go back and forth, and Jesus would say, quit arguing over this. It's foolishness. They understood that God had a special plan for Jesus, but they didn't know what it was. And Jesus flat out told them. He said, you tear this temple down, in 3 days I'll rebuild it. He said, I'm going to Jerusalem. They're going to kill me. But I'll rise again. Oh, don't say that, Jesus. They didn't listen very well. Kind of like me. When Nicole's asking me questions, I don't even listen to myself. The disciples were kind of the same way. Jesus said, come pray with me. And what did they do? They did what I do once in a while at 9 o'clock in the morning on Monday. It's one of those things where it's just like, we bumble a lot in life. Thank God God has mercy. Don't count yourself out. Even in the final second, God can intervene. God can do amazing things. And a lot of times we go, well, I'm sure He's finished with me. He's done. So look at these disciples. Look at Peter. What had Peter just done? He denied Christ 3 times. And now there's no forgiveness because Jesus is dead. He can't go up and say, I'm sorry. You can imagine the despair he was in. Andrew. He was so wanting to hightail it out of there. When somebody grabbed his robe, he ran right out of it. Ran away naked. Because he didn't want to get caught and arrested. Pretty much everybody except for John the Apostle either denied him, walked away, or ran away. And they didn't know what was happening. They just thought they didn't want to get in trouble. But then they heard about what happened on Friday. Jesus hanging on the cross. You can imagine this feeling of hopelessness. This feeling of dread. How would you feel? You devoted 3 years of your life to something, and all of a sudden, it's just over. He's probably not going to be king now. You can't have a dead king. And he taught us a lot, but how can we organize ourselves under his teachings when he's not here anymore? And how can we tell people to live in victory and hope and health when he died? Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. Saturday evening when the Sabbath ended, Mary Magdalene and Salome and Mary, the mother of James, went out and purchased burial spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. Very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, they went to the tomb. On the way, they were asking each other, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" But as they arrived, they looked up and saw the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled aside. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in white robes sitting on the right side. The women were shocked. But the angel said, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He's not here. He's risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body. Now go and tell his disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You'll see him there, just as he told you before he died." The women fled from the tomb, trembling and bewildered. They said nothing to anyone because they were too frightened. Then they briefly reported all this to Peter and his companions. Afterward, Jesus himself sent them from the east to the west with the sacred and unfailing message of salvation that gives eternal life. See, even the enemy thought that by crucifying Christ, he could put him to death. Interesting how the enemy always seems to try to do his worst, and God makes it his best. See, because what he didn't know was this. Jesus had one more move. When Jesus was dead, he had just killed an innocent man. And innocent blood had been spilled. And that innocent blood was the blood of the Lamb of God. God himself provided a sacrifice. That innocent blood was so powerful, it washed away the sins of millenniums. Amen. Think about that. And now Jesus is risen and victorious. And I wonder, you can see Satan at the cross going, checkmate. And you can see Jesus in front of that empty tomb going, checkmate. Because he had one more move. Let's bow our heads and close our eyes. This morning, I don't know where you're at in your life, but you do, God does. And there might be somebody here who's going through some pretty deep struggles. You got some questions, you got some accusations. You're going through some trials and tribulations. You don't know how you're going to make it through. So I believe you came here today, and I believe you came here this morning to hear this. God's got one more move. It may be dark. It may be scary. You may be going through a rough time, but don't give up. Because I believe the Lord can make a way in your life where there seems no way. So I'm going to ask you this morning, if you're here today and you just need a touch from God, you're just in a dark place, or you're going through a tough time, or you're needing a healing in your body, or you're maybe at your wit's end with things that are going on in your family life. People are driving you crazy. Trust God that He's got one more move, that He's going to make the situation better.